We're here to discuss an issue which I think is making all journalists, including me, increasingly thoughtful and nervous about the consequences of what they do. We're talking about investigative journalists and whistleblowers and surveillance and what happens to the journalism that matters in the wake of Snowden, Assange and Manning. And we have a panel particularly well suited to discuss these issues. Now, on my far left, we have Paul Farrell, who's a reporter at The Guardian, Australia. Just as we were walking on stage, he found out he's been shortlisted, I think, for an Amnesty International award for his reporting on asylum seeker issues, and we might talk a little bit about the implications of that a bit later on. He writes regularly on immigration, surveillance, privacy and freedom of information in Australia, and has done quite a broad range of investigations across those areas, which he's just been shortlisted for the award, as I said, so that's great. In the middle of our speakers, we have Dr. Suelette Dreyfus, who is an award-winning writer and journalist, and also a research fellow at the University of Melbourne's Department of Computing and Information Systems. She is perhaps best known outside the university as the co-author of Underground, which was the first major book about computer hacking in Australia, co-authored with Julian Assange. Before that was a household name. And we'll talk a little bit about Julian later on. And in particular, one of her research projects at the moment is the World Online Whistleblowing Survey, and we'll have a talk about some of the things that she's found out about the public attitudes to whistleblowers a little bit later in this conversation. And then immediately to my left, we have Dr. Andrea Carson, who's a lecturer in media and politics at the University of Melbourne and an honorary fellow at the Centre for Advancing Journalism. She is a researcher into the role of investigative journalism, and I think it's fair to say the state of investigative journalism and political communication, and is ideally placed to take the temperature and give us an idea of the health, I think, of investigative journalism and the impact of things such as the government's new national security legislation, which I want to start off talking about. Paul, I have to say we're not going to do the usual set-piece thing, we're just going to chat and I'm going to ask questions. Paul, you're an active reporter. You're dealing regularly with people who have reason to fear prosecution if it becomes known that they're talking to you, including, I imagine, some of the people who've been giving you information on asylum seeker issues. What do you actually have to do these days to protect your sources? What sorts of techniques do you have to employ?
That is a very, very difficult question to answer. It will often very much depend on the situation, and I guess there are two sort of parts to it, and the first is you have a legal system in Australia that facilitates a very broad range of access to telecommunications data by what is essentially an undefined number of government agencies, and that's access to metadata, and that's really concerning because essentially as soon as you make a phone call to a source, as soon as you send them an email, you are potentially exposing them to prosecution, because often as soon as there is evidence of that contact, that's all you need. So it becomes very difficult, but I guess that is why one of the most critical things is to have a good working knowledge of encryption and anonymizing techniques and obfuscation techniques in the sort of digital space. And we have to use regularly a whole lot of tools like Tails and PGP, email encryption, Tor to anonymize web traffic and things like that. We always have what's called air-gapped machines to work with. So you have a computer that's never had any contact with the internet, that potentially can't have any contact with the internet. You really need to be very, very paranoid, basically, because you simply don't know. And part of the problem is that even when you're dealing with issues like asylum seekers, where there are, you do get some quite incredible leaks and things like that in that area, the problem is the immigration department has so much power to be able to gain access to that telecommunications data in and of itself. So they are a real threat in that respect, and you have to use tools that can sort of match that threat as well. So I guess to answer that question, you have to use encryption, and if you don't, you are putting your sources at risk.
And do you ever resort to the old technology of writing a letter by hand and putting it in the mail?
Yeah, I don't. I've never had to do that.
It's been suggested to me it's now the safest way of communicating with the source.
Yeah, I mean, even the problem with that is that, you know, it is harder for people to go through the mail, but they can still, you know, go through the mail at the end of the day. And if you're known as someone who might be communicating with people that are sources in that particular way, then, you know, you're certainly going to be a red flag throughout the fantastic Australia Post system and all its wonders and ins and outs. So, yeah.
And the national security legislation, the new legislation, to what extent is that going to change this picture? I mean, you're already doing all these things. You're already obviously fearful for your sources and perhaps for yourself. But how does this change things?
I think there are two ways it changes it. And the first is, of course, the chilling effect on sources. That's because of all these new disclosure offences that are in it. So for those of you that aren't familiar with it, there are a whole series of offences that the first National Security Legislation Bill created regarding ASIO's special intelligence operations, which we don't know what they are. They are declared, or they are at the discretion of the Attorney General, which is a very broad way to do things. There's no real judicial oversight. And people are worried about that. You know, we've been reporting about it for a long time now, since that legislation was first introduced in July, but it still got through. It got through the House, it got through the Senate, with not even a whisper from the major parties, really, and with the support of the Palmer United Party. The only real opposition was the Greens and 3 crossbenchers. But it got through, and the chilling effect on sources. I mean, I had someone just the other day say to me, "Oh, look, I'm worried about these new laws. Will they affect me?" And this was someone who worked in the asylum seeker space, and they won't affect them. But the problem is, it's that fear, and that is what the chilling effect is really about.
Now, Andrea, how are we going with investigative journalism in Australia? Good shape, bad shape? What's it like?
Well, I guess there's a predominant viewpoint that as the business model for newspapers in particular and media outlets has been in decline, and we know that this has been accelerated by the arrival of the internet, which has allowed anyone to be an advertiser and also for anyone to be a purveyor of news and to provide news. All you need is a mobile phone or an internet connection and a keyboard, and that has broken some of the monopoly relationships that media has had. And there's a fairly logical, I suppose, but simple argument that because the revenues and the circulations have been falling of media outlets, that also that must mean there's less resources for investigative journalism. But in fact, when you investigate what's going on with investigative journalism, it's a very unique part of the landscape of media and newspapers in particular, which even today in Australia are still the largest employers of journalists. They can provide investigative journalism and set the agenda for a story in a way that they can't with other news. Newspapers in particular can no longer break news. That's the domain of the internet. That Twitter, we all know, watching Facebook, that breaks news. Newspapers have given up on that, but what they can do, which is very good for their brands, is be able to say that they can provide investigative journalism. And when I went through and looked at this question from the 1950s right through to 2011, I found that with each decade there was more and more investigative journalism. And often older journalists might reflect on the 1980s as being a particular golden patch for investigative journalism, and indeed it was. There were some really significant stories during that time. But in terms of quantum, there's still plenty of investigative journalism around. But I will have a caveat on this, and that is that I was looking at this investigation up until 2011, and in 2012, as many of you will remember, that was when the 2 largest newspaper groups in Australia, News Corp Australia and also Fairfax Media, announced massive job cuts. Between them, about 3,000, 1,900 from Fairfax and an undisclosed number from News Corp, but estimated to be upwards of 1,000. And so there needs to be more research to see now whether 2012 marked a tipping point, whether that is going to start to then impact on the investigative journalism resources, which until this point have been cordoned from many of the cuts and have been so important to the branding of newspapers.
Now, we've heard, including in the session just before this, that some of those numbers are perhaps being replaced or augmented by new media startups, by individuals on laptops in bedrooms doing new and interesting and exciting things. But when we're dealing with these sorts of legal threats and threats to sources, how's that square up? I mean, is the blogger on a laptop in their bedroom going to be equipped to deal with these sorts of threats?
It's a really good question, and it's one that I was interested in as well. So I was looking at online news sites that didn't have any hard copy support or resources to support them. And I found with even pretty established online sites such as Crikey, they do minimal sort of investigative journalism, probably at the level that newspapers were in the 1970s, when newspapers were really starting to take it on. So they're in a nascent phase for investigative journalism. But the question that you speak to, Margaret, about whether they have other resources to be able to do this, and this also speaks to Paul's point, is that there's so much intimidation around that it's really important to have institutional power. You need to have the moral power, first of all, to be able to do what Paul does and to be able to investigate and know that you're going to have an organisation around you that's going to protect you. You need to also have pretty deep pockets, and that means legal power, because things are being challenged in the courts. And we've seen that even if you look at a large organisation like Fairfax Media, one of its largest shareholder was challenging one of its journalists. Gina Reinhart was suing Adele Ferguson, trying to get her to reveal her sources. So you need the institutional power from that point of view as well. And the other one, I would say, is the emotional support. As an investigative journalist, you can be really put under a lot of scrutiny. You can even have other journalists that are criticising the work that you do, and I can talk about that a little bit later, but it's important to have, still at this stage, a strong institution behind you, and a blogger in a bedroom just doesn't have that.
Yeah, I want to come back to that issue of journalists supporting each other, Andrea, because I think that's really important. But I want to turn now to you, Suelette. You have been messing around in this space, I think, longer than anybody else on the stage.
She's probably doing it right now with that laptop.
Yeah, she's probably doing it right now, and probably rather presumptuously longer than anybody in the audience. I may be wrong about that. We'll find out later. And you were saying something interesting to us in the green room about your early conversations with Julian Assange. Could you recap that for us now?
I'm just trying to remember which thing I said in there.
You said you used to think he was paranoid.
Oh, I used to think he was long before WikiLeaks.
So this would be when, roughly?
Oh, in the 1990s. You know, there was this kind of golden era of the internet, really, when it was all promise and greenfield sites and open blue sky, and attempts to control freedoms were bucked against. You know, so if you think about Phil Zimmerman trying to fight the U.S. government when they accused him of illegally releasing source code for the world's first free and freely available encryption program, PGP. He was 3 years under investigation by the authorities, and in the end he won. And not only did he win, but society won, because the move by the U.S. government then, which was to install Clipper chip, a backdoored chip into all computers. So the plan was, if you were someone who did business with the U.S. government, you were going to have to install this in any machines you made, and that was eventually defeated. And so there was this kind of sense of promise and optimism, and the world is your oyster. And at that time, I felt quite, in a sense, caught up by that optimism. But Julian used to be incredibly personally paranoid about his privacy, and some of which was possibly justified. But I used to think he was perhaps a little unjustified in that, including never leaving a desktop machine in his house that wasn't password protected, fully encrypted, a set of tamper evidence security procedures of a physical nature to his information and residence. And I now look back and I realize that he was right, and he was really right. And even I, who had done research at that stage quite extensively, I mean, Underground took 3 years to research and write, was quite unprepared for how right he was. It's actually one of his, at a personal level, as a friend, I can say it's one of his more annoying qualities, is that, he says something and it seems really outlandish or paranoid, and you're kind of like, that's just ridiculous. And then 6 months or 12 months or possibly 12 years later, you go, oh, crap. He was right, but he's not one to let you forget that. So, but it's those favorite little words are true. The "I told you so" words are right. And so the dystopia that he talks about of a kind of convergence of corporate interests in the national security space and security interests. And the government interests in maintaining control over not only its information, but in the population. So the recent experiment we saw with Facebook, which I'd be astonished if it cleared ethics at a major, university, but perhaps it did. I don't know about it. That basically experimented without people's knowledge on their moods by filtering the information as being positive or negative on their Facebook feed. And you can imagine that a government who had access to that kind of mood-controlling news fed through the channel of something like Facebook, you're really in the realms, you're beyond George Orwell.
Could you imagine just before an election?
Yeah.
If someone's looking for re-election, they start doing positive mood-altering stories with a Pavlovian connection with that.
Yeah, it's it's not at all beyond the pale. I mean, we know that governments and oppositions will, try and influence the media to their best benefit, as is their, rational behavior in their, motivational framework to influence things prior to election. But given this sort of power, what political party wouldn't grab it by the horns and use it?
And so, turning now to whistleblowers, and if we can think about it from the other side of the notebook, if you like, or of the computer. I mean, I think most people who have been employed in an organisation, generally speaking, have some degree of loyalty to the organisation, maybe not. And there is something a little bit contradictory, isn't there, in our society of giving legal protection to an unauthorised disclosure, legal protection to somebody who wants to leak. And yet when we talk about shield laws, we are. What does your research tell you, Suelette, about how the general public feels about whistleblowing? So
it's quite interesting. We've done a couple of different ways of approaching understanding what the public attitudes are to this, including some public surveying that is a representative sample of the population.
This is worldwide?
Yeah. Well, we've done it in Australia and in the UK, and there's some work as well in Iceland. But then we've also done an online survey of some of the same questions, which is less of a gold standard, but does provide some interesting points of comparison between people who identify themselves as whistleblowers or potential whistleblowers or not whistleblowers. And the first thing that we find that's very interesting is that in Australian society, according to the gold standard of actually surveying society, so the representative sample, half of the population of Australia and about that in the UK find that there is too much secrecy in organisations in our society. Half. That's pretty big. That is not a vote of confidence in the level of transparency that we've got in our society today. The online, so the internet-based community that responded to that was much higher, so 85% or so. So that's sort of, if you think of that community as being perhaps more representative of a technology using, social media active, that sort of community, that says that there's an even deeper feeling of it, a much deeper feeling of it in that population. In terms of support for whistleblowers, there were some surprising findings in terms of, you expect Australia to be a kind of anti-dauber culture, that's what you would expect. Well, no, that's not what it is. So in fact, in Australia, we asked people, do you think that whistleblowers should be punished or supported? And we made people think a bit in the survey. So we made them say, okay, should they be supported even if they're revealing information from inside their organization? So in other words, expressing the, in a sense, betrayal of trust and making people think a minute about that. And despite that, people came back and said 81% of Australians think that whistleblowers should be supported, not punished. That is I mean, really, okay, political pollsters, like advisors to ministers, you get to 65, 67%. Whew, they're just over the moon. 81% is just huge. And it really sets a contrast to the level of protection that exists in society for whistleblowers relative to what the public wants. And that figure was consistent not only in Australia, but also almost identical in the UK. Now, I mean, our cultures are very similar, but that shows you something. In Iceland, it was even higher. I think it was 87%. And so that shows, well, actually, across a set of cultures, even cultures that don't speak the same languages, you have a really strong preference. And for me, it's quite interesting culturally to look at it in Australia, because it says to me, perhaps, that the idea of almost an extension of the fair go mentality, that is, trying to protect someone who's trying to do the right thing, trumps the anti-dauber streak in society.
Yeah. Now, Paul, obviously we use the word whistleblowing and it's almost sort of prejudging the issue. We're seeing this person as being a legitimate watchdog, if you like, on society. But, I mean, we all know, those of us who've worked as journalists, that sources can have multiple motivations. Now, if you're thinking about some of your sources, and obviously I'm not asking you to go even close to identifying them, but what pushes somebody into deciding to come to a journalist and talk?
I think it can be a whole range of things, but particularly in the sort of asylum space and in immigration detention, where people are constantly seeing really horrifying things on a daily basis, it's this sort of sense of indignation and of helplessness that what they're doing is not enough within the system that they're in, and that the system is broken. And I think those are the best kinds of whistleblowers, to be honest, and I wish there was a lot more of them. But, you know, those kind of people who will come out and, you know, will sometimes they'll start out just with documents or just with small tips, and sometimes they go all the way. And, you know, as we've seen this year, there has been a lot of whistleblowers in the immigration space. Just recently, my colleague Oliver Lachlan spoke with Dr. Peter Young, the IHMS doctor, the chief medical officer there, who spoke out about his time in detention. There was Martin Appleby, the G4S guard, who was there during the Manus Island unrest, and there's, you know, so many more, and I think those kind of whistleblowers are, you know, are very courageous people. That said, there are lots of other things that can motivate whistleblowers. Sometimes it can be a power grab. I mean, there really are just all kinds of motivations to people. You know, sometimes they might just not like what their boss is doing and want to shaft them. You know, it can be as simple as that. And sometimes, of course, it's some sort of sanctioned leak from the government and things like that. And those are the ones that I think you need to be the most cautious about, because, you know, if you are taking leaks from an entity, a powerful entity that you're meant to be holding account in the first place, then I don't really think that's the best kind of journalism at all. And I think, in fact, I don't think very much about that in any way. Yeah.
Now, your organisation, The Guardian, obviously published the Snowden revelations. Could you still do that now?
It's an interesting question. You know what? I think we would anyway, notwithstanding. The issue is with these new national security laws, you have what's called special intelligence operations, as I mentioned. And if in 2 years from now there was another Edward Snowden that came along and they leaked a whole bunch of documents that were to do with special intelligence operations, then those disclosures would be subject to the penalties there. And we could be facing jail, that source could be facing jail, anyone who republished that material, even if you tweeted it on Facebook or on Twitter, you could go to jail for that. That's the risk, and that is a real risk. I think we would sure as hell publish them again if that situation happened again, though. You know, at the end of the day, it just comes down to what the risk is and how important the public interest is in the release of the documents. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it is that there is that fear there that, you know, that journalists could be caught when they're doing that level of stories, could be caught by those disclosure provisions. And I think it's absolutely appalling that the two major parties and the Palmer United Party supported that legislation. You know, there was such a muted response from the two major parties. It's really phenomenal when you consider what this actually does.
Is there any reason, though? I mean, surely we are dealing with national security here. There may be some need for protection. How do we know that Edward Snowden or Julian Assange, for example, hasn't put lives at risk or security of operations at risk? I mean, where does the balance lie, do you think?
I think just on that point about Assange's and Edward Snowden's disclosures, there's really been no evidence whatsoever to suggest that any of their disclosures have endangered anyone. And the reporting has been incredibly responsible for this. With the Edward Snowden disclosures, it's not as though there have been the names of agents just published, totally out there in the public domain. Often that level of national security legislation, of national security reporting, is done very responsibly. And I think that's something that the government has conveniently chosen to ignore. But even if that's true, and there are some things that do need to be held secret, the kind of operations that they're restricting publication about are the very kind of operations that there does need to be scrutiny of, because what special intelligence operations are, they give immunity to ASIO offers for uses of force. They give them an extraordinary mandate, an extraordinary breadth of powers where something could foreseeably go wrong. And if an agent was killed, if civilians were killed, you would not be able to report on that. And that's something that's really concerning.
But not all, I was going to come to you, Andrea, not all journalists would agree with that, would they, Andrea? Some have been quite critical of the Glenn Greenwalds of the world.
Well, I was really interested in Suelette's comments and research about what ordinary Australians and other countries' nationals are saying about the need for whistleblowing, because the reality is we can't sugarcoat this. Whistleblowers get treated appallingly. And we only have to think about Daniel Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers back in the 70s, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange. There is common themes about the way that they get demonised, and that is that they're crazy, or that they're pariahs of society, that they don't belong, that they're loners, that they've never socially adjusted. All these recurring themes get used about whistleblowers, and they can be very persuasive. Who wants to hang out with someone who's a bit crazy or a bit mad or not quite right? And Glenn Greenwald, who was with The Guardian and who broke the Snowden leaks. And I should say, you raised a really important point about Snowden. That was, he was so cautious about not doing damage that he went to an institution that had authority, such as The Guardian. He went to a journalist who was previously a lawyer who'd been writing on this area for a very long time, and he said, I will not dictate what stories you choose to reveal. I will leave that to your journalistic expertise. And that was another safeguard that Snowden wanted to put in place. And Glenn Greenwald, and I implore you to read No Place to Hide. He gives a very forthright account of the relationship with Snowden. He says that he interviewed him for hours and hours and hours on end just to make sure that he was psychologically sound and that he was the real deal, that his motives weren't pernicious or that there wasn't something else going on underneath the scene, that he was genuinely wanting to release information for the public good. And he came to the conclusion that he was the real deal. But Glenn Greenwald then became a target, and not, as you would expect, among perhaps some government agencies that wanted to suppress this information, but by journalists. Journalists from even the New York Times at times saying that he wasn't a journalist, that he was an activist, that he was a co-conspirator, that he was a polemicist. And this in itself is very, very dangerous, because apart from the fact that he's a Pulitzer Award-winning journalist and he's been writing in this space for a very long time, the moment you take the tag of journalist away from a journalist, they lose some of the protections that they've had. And not only that, journalists end up doing the work of governments that are trying to suppress information, and that is the very antithesis of what journalism should be. Journalists should be holding power to account, not having fear, not having favour, and being able to stand up, because if you can't have the Fourth Estate standing up to power on behalf of the people, then who can do that? And this is a point that Glenn Greenwald makes very well in his book.
So why do journalists do that, do you think? Why is that happening? What does it say about the state of the profession?
Well, to give a sympathetic account perhaps, when I first started reading Greenwald's book, and I've been working in this space, I've been a working journalist, I teach about media and politics, I turned to my husband and I said to him, don't we all know that we're being watched? That where's the surprise in this? Of course all our data's being collected, it's metadata, what does it matter? It's content. It's only when I got to the end of Greenwald's book that he makes such a persuasive and strong argument that metadata tells as much of a story about our lives as what the content does. And Suelette will know a lot more about that than I do. But I think some journalists have very senior positions in their organisations. Perhaps they're not realising the extent of the surveillance that there's a common argument journalists put forward, and that is if you have nothing to hide, then there's no problem with having your data looked at. Well, that's all good and well if things are going swimmingly in your life, but the other aspect of that is why should 23 million Australians have that level of invasion of their privacy to capture the very few that might be doing the wrong thing? It's a reverse onus.
Somebody put it well to me the other night. They said, OK, you've got nothing to hide, but, remember that last time you were upset or worried about something and you Googled something, or you're concerned about your teenage children or about your health, and you Googled something. Would you want people to know that? And, of course, people can know that, can't they, Suelette? Can I ask you about your personal practices? I mean, I'm making an assumption here and you don't have to confirm, but I assume you might still have a bit to do with the occasional hacker. Do you take your mobile phone?
No.
What else do you do?
Or if I do, it's in so many pieces. It's not going to be working anytime soon.
So what else do you do to protect your sources?
Well, let's just think about how much we want to say to the public about that. So there are evasive ways you can deal with physical surveillance that I probably won't talk much about. But you've also, at the height of your paranoia in dealing with someone who's potentially very, very much at risk, and this is going to sound, slightly crazy, but it's true. You've got to do things like, wear new clothes. You've got to worry about tracking devices in things like shoes. I mean, it sounds paranoid, but it's not. If you're dealing with someone like Snowden, it's not. You absolutely can't take anything electrical with you that might have a tracking device in it, including computers, modems, all of that stuff. GPS devices, cars increasingly are a problem. You've got to worry about facial recognition software and cameras, so CCTV cameras wherever. You've got to be quite careful about that. If you're going to be out in a place that's an open space, even if you're away for cameras, you've got to think about even, are there issues looking up? So there are a lot of things you have to be really aware of. There are things you can buy. You can buy, bags that you can put around your iPod and your iPad and your mobile phone that supposedly, stop reception. I wouldn't actually take a phone to a very important meeting anyway, but, those can at least reduce your likelihood, because I can assure you, for those of you who have iPhones in the audience, do not assume that your phone is off when your phone is off. Because the technology that we've seen come out of the Snowden and other revelations suggests that there's hot micing capability on it, so you can turn on the mic, the camera, recording devices remotely, so basically hacking into them remotely. And you may not be of that much interest, but you might be. And one of the things that we've seen, of course, and in many ways is very telling for the new national security legislation, is that it allows ASIO to hack not only many, many more computers on the basis of one computer. So I love how the legislation has translated computer into computers. So welcome to a network of 10,000 computers on one warrant. But much more importantly, the range that the intelligence agencies, range of powers that they have to tap into perfectly innocent people's devices that they did not have before is quite substantial. And their argument is, of course, but we might have to get to this person to get to the terrorist. Well, maybe, but exactly how many innocent people are you going to have to trample over their privacy to get to this? So there are a set of things you can do, and obviously using something like Tails is quite useful. I've got some involvement in an interesting new developing piece of software that will hopefully not leave a trail of metadata. And we'll see how that goes. And there are products out there, but you have to be very careful where they come from, that you can buy, for example, for encryption over VoIP, internet based conversations. I mean, obviously, if you want to use something like Skype, it's great that it's free, but it's absolutely backdoored. You cannot trust the privacy. I mean, you might be able to trust it from, Fred, the fraudster down the street, but trusting it in terms of your privacy from national security, no. So I think, and in fact, it's very interesting because it's potentially quite bad for businesses that are in this business and operate out of places like Australia and the US, because increasingly, as people become more aware of this, who would buy a product from there? It's obviously been tampered with by the US government and the Australian government, the Five Eyes. It's actually better for organizations that make these software products or whatever elsewhere. So that, I think, would be a quite interesting secondary consideration.
Look, personally, I've spent a fair bit of time over the last couple of years in China and talking to journalists and activists in China, and they take it for granted, of course, that their equivalents of Skype and so on are possibly monitorable.
Yeah,
but I think many Westerners would have trouble with that concept, but it is also true.
I would just encourage one other thing, which is if you care about this stuff and want to get active in it, look at the Twitter hashtag Stop Data Retention.
Stop Data Retention.
Stop Data Retention or Stop the Spies. It's a campaign being run by Electronic Frontier Foundation. But it's quite important for average people to understand this. And, if you're worried about your privacy, speak up, because if you don't do it now, it will just be disappearing with round after round of national security legislation. And what we've seen just pass is the tip of the iceberg of what's coming.
Now, Paul, I want to ask you for a moment, and I'll come to the other two panellists on this as well, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. So if you've got a question, you will get a chance in about 5 minutes. But if we can just sort of reflect back and reflect forward a little bit, Paul, what has been the long-term impact, do you think, of WikiLeaks, of Julian Assange and of Snowden? Has it changed everything forever, or is it a spent force, or somewhere in between those two?
I think absolutely the impact of WikiLeaks and of Edward Snowden has really changed the world. One of the ways it's done that is that it has really woken people up to what is happening. The surveillance apparatus that Edward Snowden revealed is just phenomenally broad, and I think what a lot of people forget is that almost every time you see a new document that was from the NSA that Edward Snowden obtained and has been released, it's also released to Australia. It's released to the Five Eyes, and I think you really have to ask. And I think it still hasn't. Maybe this is something that will hopefully grab on. Is just the fact that every single one of these documents is released to Australia. How broadly is Australia really involved in this? And do you really think that all these programs that we've had revealed, aren't able to seize all Australians' data, and that Australians' data isn't being sent offshore? I mean, it clearly is, and and I think, in fact, Julian actually just did a submission on this to the Telecommunications and Deception Inquiry. It's the capacity for surveillance by these intelligence agencies is just breathtaking, and I think people are starting to wake up, and particularly journalists are starting to realise that they need to protect themselves better. What does concern me, though, is that I don't think journalists, particularly in Australia, have responded enough to this. The level of knowledge of encryption and obfuscation and anonymisation techniques is really not where it should be in Australia. And I think it really has to be an institutional response. So it has to come from, journalism schools need to teach people how to use these tools, and it has to come.
For you, mate.
Oh no, already planning it. Suelette and I have talked.
Great. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, exactly. And it has to come from newsrooms as well. And newsrooms. I mean, it is astonishing sometimes that I still occasionally see journalists in Australia solicit confidential tips over email. I mean, the breathtaking stupidity of that. I mean, honestly, the stupidity of that is just beyond belief. And it's the most reckless thing to do. I mean, it's negligent, as far as I'm concerned. It's an unbelievably silly thing to do. Because the most basic, the local council could find out who is who's using the IP address that from this email at this time. So do you really think that this is a confidential tip in any way? It's not. It's an unbelievably silly thing to do, and it worries me that journalists still do this. And why aren't their colleagues tapping them on the shoulder and saying, "Mate, that's not on"? So there's that aspect of it. I think in terms of journalism itself, it's really changed the processes and the practices. I really admire what WikiLeaks have done with their sort of style of the primary publishing vast amounts of primary sources in in effect in its entirety or as much of it as you possibly can is, I think, a great thing that's happened, and the same with the sort of Edward Snowden disclosures as well, because it's really critical to have all the primary material available, and it's important for history, it's important for journalism and all those kind of things. I mean, the historical archive that is the diplomatic cables is going to be a resource for decades or centuries to come, and it's really a fantastic thing.
Now, Andrea, how would you assess the long-term impact of WikiLeaks, perhaps, if we just stick to that for the moment?
Yeah, I think I'd make a really simple point, and that is that one of the reasons I imagine you, like I, like living in Australia, is that we have liberty, we have freedom, we live in a democratic society. And WikiLeaks and Snowden remind us of what we condemn and what we don't want to become. And one of the dangers with this increased level of government surveillance, which is being authorised through the courts and also through the parliament, is that in order to protect ourselves, we're taking away some of our liberties to do that. And one of the points that's made very well by Glenn Greenwald is that when you look at the number of ordinary people that die from terrorist attacks, it's still less than a number of Americans who die in the bath each year. And that's kind of really comes home to me. The other aspect I would say about that is we look at what's happened to Peter Grester, who was jailed in Egypt for 7 years for...
and whose parents will be here tomorrow for
his journalism. In Burma, in July, 5 journalists were jailed for reporting on a security function of their government. Is that where we want to head? Thanks to the assistance of the Palmer Party, journalists can be jailed up to 10 years now if they do reveal information that is deemed to be secret. So I think that's a question for all of us, and that's what Julian Assange and that's what Snowden remind us of, is that how much do we value our liberty and what sort of society do we want to live in?
And Suelette, just before we go to questions from the audience, and I do want to leave time for that, I'm going to ask you, how is Julian?
Well, Julian is that, you work with someone for 3 years on a book, you get to know them pretty well. And I'd say he's holding up pretty well, other than being somewhat paler than usual. I think you don't spend all that time inside in the UK, which doesn't get a lot of sun anyway, and you obviously are a bit paler, but otherwise holding up pretty well. He has a very steely aspect to his personality, which I think has stood him very well in this environment. It's a rare quality, I think, to have that kind of mental toughness. It's almost like a marathon runner's mental toughness, and I think many a more average person, myself included, would long ago have broken under the situation that he's in, effectively under house arrest for several years now. But yeah, no, all things considered, he's holding up pretty well psychologically.
And you saw him last when?
A few months ago.
So
I caught up with him.
Okay, well, at this point we will turn to the audience for questions. You should be aware that this session is being recorded. In a totally open and transparent fashion. The video will be available on the Wheeler Centre website and also the website of the Centre for Advancing Journalism. So please do wait for the microphone to come to you. And we have a first question here, is that right?
Yes. Good evening. My question is, do you see any of these powers being wound back any time?
No, is my answer.
Paul, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think the first tranche has passed, and that is going to be there for a long time. The real battle, though, now is the second tranche, which hasn't passed the Senate or the House yet, and the third one, which is data retention. So I think there's certainly still time, if people are sort of active enough and there is enough pressure placed on legislators to make them realise that, you know, the public is not happy with this. So, you know, it's not too late if you know, you really want to stop the second and third tranche.
And Suelette, any hope?
I think there is hope. I think there's certainly hope for stopping or modifying the next tranche. But everyone has to get off their bum and send emails in to your senators, Liberal, Labor. I mean, I think that the opposition's position on the last tranche of national security legislation was a disgrace. They were not a federal opposition. They were yes men. I watched that go through the Senate. And they were yes men. They could not nod their heads fast enough. And it was really only Senator Ludlam, a set of people from the Greens, and the independents like Nick Xenophon, who frankly had any balls on the issue. And you know, and that's saying it like it is. Now, I think that the opposition could behave like a real opposition with a little bit of pressure from the public. I think they need to hear from people that that it's an issue for them, and that the backbenchers who are Liberals also need to hear it. The irony of this is that I think that most Liberals would consider themselves perhaps more progressive on this issue than your average Labor supporter would. You know, and that it must be an affront to a reasonable number of Liberal supporters to say, wait a minute, I really value privacy. This is taking away some of my individual freedoms. But I think people, it's a complex issue. Data retention is like, well, what does that mean? What is metadata? I mean, heaven knows our learned Attorney General, who's a barrister, couldn't explain what it was. So it's not surprising that it's hard to get the population across it, but this is do or die.
The political reality is that when it comes to issues of national security, Australia has a long history of bipartisan support, and even at the expense of what the public thinks. And this is true of going into the Iraq War, of the weapons of mass destruction debate. It was largely agreement between the two major parties. And in this country, it's compulsory voting, it's a two major party system, and unless you see a radical departure from the way that the two-party system operates on national security, I don't feel that we're going to see a change in the security environment, especially when it's being led by the Obama administration.
Just kind of following on from that question, I mean, there's been a lot of public outrage and both the major parties have condemned the Egyptian government for their treatment of Peter Grest and the other Al Jazeera journalists. Do you think in the Australian circumstance it would take the arrest of a journalist for the public to then kind of backlash against the government and for this to kind of change?
I'll throw that to you, Andrea.
It's a great question. I don't know if the government would want to test it because the new Act has discretionary power for the minister to determine whether there's been a breach or not. And for precisely the reasons implicit in your question, that would be quite a test. Journalists, and we've already had Paul say that he wouldn't let it stop him reporting, so you're going to have a butting of heads between institutions that understand their role as the fourth estate coming up against a government, and a government would have to be pretty sure of itself to want to test that. So the reality of seeing a journalist in jail as a breach of this, I'm not so sure on national security issues, although there is precedent with other issues. Darren Hinch has been in jail a number of times.
Yeah, that's true.
And I'm sure Meg's got a memory of other journalists that have not given up their sources and have been challenged by government. But hopefully we won't see the day where this is actually tested.
But I'll tell you who it will potentially really screw over is new journalists. So the journalists who are involved in new media who don't have the backing of big organisation. If you were the government and you were going to go after someone who was doing this story, you would go after the blogger, the Twitter journalist, you know, the sole operator out of their bedroom, because they're easy pickings.
What do you think, Paul? Are you planning to be the test case?
We'll visit.
Yeah, we'll all visit, yes.
If there are any ASIO people out there right now, just keep this on the down low. Yeah, look, I mean, I wouldn't want to be the test case for that, but I mean, I don't think that I think Andrea's right. I think it's probably less likely that it'll be some kind of legacy journalist, and it's more likely it'll be some kind of journalist who occupies a non-traditional, sort of more adversarial space. And I hope that, if that happens, that the public still rallies behind them, and that more legacy media organisations still rally behind them as well, because that's critical. And I think that's what also some of the partnerships that the Snowden and the WikiLeaks disclosures have shown are quite important as well. Being able to partner with other types of news organisations is also still really critical.
So it will be the slightly odd, immoderate blogger who was the first person jailed rather than somebody from mainstream media, probably. Yeah. Okay, another question. The gentleman here has a question.
Insofar as I don't really think the individuals that have caused this problem are going to be our saviours, it seems to me like the Fourth Estate should focus more on being a PR industry for the encryption industry, rather than trying to convince voters to vote in the right people. Meaning, the more ASIO spies on us, the more profitable it will potentially become for entrepreneurial people to create technologies to disable the spying. So in that way, it's not necessarily a bad thing that more and more spying is happening, because the individuals, to my mind, who are isolated here are not the people in this room. The increasingly isolated people are those that have to be on the TV screen defending these actions. So I just was wondering about the panel's idea about, promoting encryption technology in a user-friendly way to disable the spying in a sort of PR fashion, how, say, a pharmaceutical company might send sales reps to see doctors using journalists in the same manner for the public, approaching it from that point of view.
I'll ask you to comment on that, Suelette.
Well, I think that unfortunately the media is more fragmented when it comes to looking after its own interests than it should be. And that includes not potentially understanding that more and better partnerships with technologists are in its advantage. Now, there have been some improvements in that. There have been, Strongbox, there have been improvements whereby, some media organizations have set up drop boxes that are certainly much more secure. One, questions that there are, attacks that may be successful against them, but God knows they're 100 times better than what was there before. But I think that a better pairing would be absolutely in journalists' interests. And the technology and media organizations have kind of come to understand that. By the way, there's a whole coding community out there, the open source community, who are really gung-ho for this sort of thing, and they want to help because they understand. I mean, if I can, make some gross generalizations about them being, geeky and often perhaps having lived the lives of outsiders, they understand what it is to be the kid in the schoolyard who's isolated and picked on. So they're like, yeah, let's make tools to protect, the whistleblower, the people who are the outsiders who are picked on. And so in that sense, they're a wonderful resource for the journalistic community. But let's also understand that journalist organizations don't always act in their own best interest. So if we look at News Limited, which has gone, absolutely bananas covering this issue of foreign fighters for the last 3 months, major pictures, front page, splashing stories, hype, even though we're talking about, a few dozen Australians overseas. Meanwhile, they're making a submission to the federal parliament going, but these national security, with the other media organizations, these national security laws that are proposed are actually bad for freedom of journalism and freedom of speech. Well, that is completely, you can't really, reconcile these two positions. They would seem to me very much at odds because the Australians' reporting on the national security stuff has really been, in a sense, served the interests of the intelligence community in hyping this up in the lead up to the voting on the national security legislation. And one queries whether the timing of the release of these stories about foreign fighters was entirely accidental.
You want to comment on that at all, Paul or Andrew?
Yeah, I'm a little bit wary about calling anything we do PR, and I wouldn't quite describe it in that way, but I would agree that it's important to encourage people to use encryption more, and maybe there is room for some sort of campaign on that, to sort of, an educational initiative on that, because it is really important. But yes, not PR is a dirty word as far as I'm concerned.
Well, there's media and there's news media, and half this battle's already been lost. If you look at the largest media companies in the world, such as Google, they've been complicit with the NSA in allowing them access to their metadata, which is our metadata. So we also have to think about the way that we use media. There's a blurring between the public and between the private. We post all sorts of things about ourselves on Facebook. Those security parameters are changed all the time. Some of the stuff we don't intend to be out in the public realm is in the public realm. It's much more than about encryption. I've got a friend who is a little controlling, I guess you could say, and she keeps tabs on her husband by using Find My Phone, and will track him about where he is. Oh, he's not at the shops. He said he'd be at the shops now. So we are using this technology ourselves. The media's role is, the news media's role is to raise awareness about what it means to our civil liberties, what it means to the type of society we want to live in, and we as individuals need to make choices about who we want to be as people.
Hi, I'm a journalist and I actually teach investigative journalism, and I was just wondering, these new laws, do you think it's going to make students and future journalists more reluctant from actually taking up investigative journalism, because it would be so much easier to just do normal news?
Well, I teach student journalists. I would say that my students could be divided into two cohorts: those who are terrified and do it anyway, and those who are thrilled. And I'm not sure which is the better attitude. What do you think, Paul? Will student journalists be less willing to take this stuff up?
Oh, look, I don't think so. I mean, I think the kind of students who want to do that kind of journalism are going to do it whatever the hell the legal framework says. I mean, it certainly, as I said, it certainly wouldn't stop me. And I think the rest of the students, if they probably don't have, if they're not interested in investigative reporting, then that's fine. They don't have to do that. But I mean, you've got to have passion and drive to be able to do this, and you've got to have that sense of righteous indignation. And the existence of a couple of disclosure provisions, I don't think is going to really discourage anyone. And if they are concerned, then tell them not to be. Well, actually, maybe don't, because then if they go to the jail, you'll feel bad. But
there is this one thing I should mention as a reference. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a not-for-profit out of the US, has a self-defense guide, which is quite useful. It's a couple of years old, but it's quite useful in looking at how you can improve your privacy from a technology perspective, and I recommend looking at it.
Thank you very much for being here today. That is it for today. I hope you'll talk about the events.